Good morning. It's Bernard Nomberg with another weekly episode of NOMBERG Law Live, and I'm so very pleased and honored to have J. Mason Davis here as my guest. Good morning, Mr. Davis.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well, sir. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing pretty good for an old man.
Well, we're going to talk today about Mr. Davis's career, and there's so much to share. I could talk to this man for hours, but we're going to try and focus on a couple of key areas. And if you guys know Mr. Davis, you know he has lived a lifetime in Birmingham and seen and done just about all that is here in Birmingham's history, particularly going back through the civil rights era. And that's what has drawn me to having Mr. Davis talking with me today. So I really appreciate you giving me some of your time this morning.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Mr. Davis, for folks who don't know you, and I'm sure there may only be a few now, as high profile as Mr. Davis has been in his practice and his life here, if you would, share a little bit of your background. Where'd you grow up, and tell us a little bit about your schooling.
Okay. Well, my name is Julian Mason Davis, Jr. I was born in the very middle of the Depression era on July 30th, 1935. On my mother's side of the family, they were business people. My grandfather and grandmother and aunt came up from Montgomery to Birmingham in 1893. And my grandfather and his sister, Hattie Davenport, went into the general mercantile business in Birmingham, and they stayed in that business for about 6 years until the sister said to the brother, let's put your training into operation. And my grandfather had been trained in Montgomery as an embalmer and a funeral director by Mr. H.A. Lovelace. And many of you may know about Lovelace High School, a Lovelace school in Montgomery. Anyway, my grandfather and his sister opened Davenport and Harris Funeral Home on November 15, 1899. And that business is still in operation today, and it's over 120 years of age. And we think that it may be the oldest business in the state of Alabama among blacks, and maybe between blacks and whites. My father's father, he came up by himself from Montgomery in also 1893, and he met my grandmother, who was a teacher here in Birmingham, and they married. And I have a copy of the wedding invitation that my grandfather printed on his printing press, because not only was he a teacher and a principal, he also engaged in the printing business. He had a little business called the Terminal Printing Company, and it was in a little house that he built behind his home house that was on 6th Avenue and 26th Street, where the Red Mountain Expressway passes over today. And it was there before the terminal station was built. And he and my grandmother married in 1898, and their oldest child was Jack Davis, who was born in 1899. In a way, I have followed in their footsteps because I taught at the University of Alabama for 25 years, beginning in 1972. I taught the first two African-American graduates of the University of Alabama Law School, Michael Figures, who was a state senator and who unfortunately died at an early age, and Jackson, who is a lawyer here in Birmingham. Anyway, I went down to Montgomery for 25 years every Wednesday night, and I taught. And I have taught an appreciable number of all the lawyers that practice in the state of Alabama. In any event, I grew up in Birmingham. I attended Tuggle Elementary School. My mother and I my sister and my mother and I lived with my mother's mother after my father died. My father had been the principal at Thomas Elementary School, but he died from pneumonia in December of 1937, and during his time, there was no medication that was invented or discovered in the medical field that could be given to treat pneumonia. If a person caught it, in 8 days they were dead. They drowned to death from the fluid that built up in their lungs. In any event, my mother, my sister, and I grew up on Enon Ridge. I attended Tuggle School, and after then I attended Parker High School. After graduating from there, I attended Talladega College. That's about 60 miles away from here. And after graduating from there, I came out and I met segregation head on, because I applied to the University of Alabama for entrance, and they told me in no uncertain terms that people of my African ethnicity were not welcome at Tuscaloosa. So I then went to Buffalo, where Hattie Davenport's daughter and her grandson were living, and I enrolled at State University of New York at Buffalo. I stayed there 3 years, and I graduated law review, coming back to Birmingham in 1959.
Let me ask you real quick
Sure.
about that. It really seemed like such a conflict in that you weren't admitted to the University of Alabama for law school, but didn't either the law school or the state offer stipends for
Yes.
to go out of state in exchange for not suing them?
That's right. That's the whole point. That they, in turn, in order I guess it was a bribe to us. They would give you the difference between the state of Alabama Board of Education would give the difference between the cost of attending the University of Alabama School of Law and wherever you went to law school outside of the state of New York. Had you gone to Oxford in England, they would have paid for that, or to Heidelberg in Germany, they would have paid that difference to you, because it was the cost of going to the University of Alabama and as a resident of the state of Alabama, and the cost of going to the law school that you would attend.
So you graduated from SUNY Buffalo
That's
Law
right.
School.
That's right.
And then you came back south.
That's right.
And when and where did you open your first law practice?
Well, I opened my practice on April 15th, 1960. I was mailed a letter by the Secretary of the State Bar notifying me that I had successfully passed the bar examination and that I was then ready to take the oath of office. I was not invited to Montgomery with the others to be inducted into the Alabama State Bar Association to be given my license. But my license was mailed to me, and I took an oath that I immediately took down to Mr. Arthur Shore's office, and I got his secretary, Agnes Stuttermeyer, to notarize my signature. And I sent that back to Montgomery, and they sent my license to me. And then I went to practice with two of my good friends, Orzel Billingsley, who had graduated from Talladega, and Peter A. Hall, who was a lifelong friend of the Harris family. And I practiced with them until 1963, when I then moved down the hall, and this is in the Masonic Temple building. That building is still standing today on the corner of 4th Avenue and 17th Street.
And if my math is right, you're entering your 59th year of law practice?
I am entering my 60th year.
60th?
That's right.
Oh, that's fantastic. What a blessing. What a blessing. What a
Thank you.
blessing.
Thank you.
And you coming out of law school and opening your practice in Birmingham, Alabama in 1960, this is the heart and the heat of the civil rights era.
Well, yes, the civil rights era really began in the 1930s when Arthur Shores was licensed to practice law, and he began to take cases that were brought to him by various members that were of African American ethnicity. And he tried some of the early cases, the Steele case, that took away the stigma of a black man being relegated to a position of fireman on the railroad and not being elevated to the position of the engineer, though he did the work of the engineer. And he also handled the case of Mary Means Monk that dealt with open housing in the city of Birmingham. Birmingham had a practice of designating communities. I grew up on Enon Ridge that was separated from Fountain Heights that was on the east of Enon Ridge and separated from North Smithfield that was on the west. And down in the Smithfield area, at the foot of, well, not quite at the foot of the hill of Center Street, that on the west side of Center Street was a no-no territory for blacks to live, and the western 50-feet strip on the east side of Center Street was prohibited for blacks to build on. And so he took the Mary Means Monk case. Miss Monk wanted to buy that house that she wanted to live in on the west side of Center Street, and they went to court, and ultimately Mr. Shores won the case for Ms. Monk. She moved in the morning, and that night they bombed the house. That began the bombings on the area that became known as Dynamite Hill.
When you and Mr. Hall and Mr. Billingsley started your practice, what type of cases were you all taking on?
As my wife would say, he took anything that walked in the door. He sat in his office and he waited to hear the pitter-patter of little feet coming down the hall toward him. But in 1962, we were asked by John Cashin and others in Huntsville to come to Huntsville and represent 125 African Americans that had been arrested for doing the very first sit-in demonstrations in the state of Alabama. Sit-in was where the student would go to the lunch counter of a segregated five and dime. In this case, they went to the Terry Hutchins Walgreen drugstore, and they sat down at the lunch counter and they asked to be served a hamburger and a Coca-Cola. And the waitress had been pre-told that they were coming, and so the police were on guard, and so the waitress would not answer them when they asked to be served, and she would immediately call the police, and the police would come and they would arrest the demonstrator. And after 125 had been arrested, then that's when the group in Huntsville called us, and we went up, and I told you a little bit before I began talking that this, when everyone that was of African American ethnicity was prohibited from asking for a room in a hotel. And that's another thing that we got into a little bit later on. But during this time, we would have to drive to Huntsville early in the morning, leaving about 6 o'clock, getting up to Huntsville, and we would go up Highway 79 because that was a direct route to Huntsville rather than going up Highway 31 to Decatur and then coming back 22 miles. So we would drive up on that 2-lane road in the morning, try the cases and get in the car and drive back home at night, and we would be tired, but we would eat dinner with our families and go to sleep and get up again at 6 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, and leave again at 6 o'clock to go to Huntsville.
For those of you just joining us or watching live or later on, I'm sitting with J. Mason Davis, and I can't tell you enough about this fine gentleman, and he is really giving us an education and some insight to what it was like practicing law and living in Birmingham in the 50s and 60s. Thank you again for tuning in.
we tried those cases in the Huntsville City Court, and the judge there's name was Horace Garth, Garth, and I'll never forget his rulings that were always against our asking to enter objections to things that were occurring, and we lost all the cases in the city court. We appealed the cases over to the circuit court, and we lost all the cases there. We then made an agreement with the city of Huntsville's lawyer to take 2 cases as test cases, and we appealed those cases down to Montgomery to the Alabama Court of Appeals. That was before that court had been split into the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals and Alabama Court of Civil Appeals. And fortunately won all those cases because the judge who tried the cases and entered the judgment was Judge Annie Lola Price, and she found that the city of Huntsville had not filed warrants for the arrest of these students, and that was not entered into the record, and so there was nothing there that the city of Huntsville could prove against our defendants. So they won all the cases. And the interesting thing about Judge Price was that she was a female, and at the time that she entered that opinion, she could not have served on the jury had she been asked to serve by the jury board, because women were prohibited from serving on juries in 1962.
Much like there were no hotels in downtown Huntsville for you, Mr. Price, Mr. Billingsley, to stay in.
That's right.
But yet you're able to represent these folks in the cases. Just a lot of hurdles, I'm sure, that you had to overcome and deal with every single day.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. Most people think that blacks did not become lawyers until the 1900s. But in the city of Birmingham, there were 2 lawyers, Mr. E.A. Brown and Mr. L.L. Chambliss, that were licensed around the turn of the 20th century, and they practiced until their deaths in the late 1930s. And before them, there had been lawyers that were of African American ethnicity.
Well, Mr. Davis, take us through the 60s and 70s with your law practice. What type of work did you handle, and who did you deal with?
I handle all cases of every type. Suits to quiet the title, suits to have property sold for a division of the proceeds among the joint owners, estate practice. I handle cases that involve voter discrimination. In fact, I can remember when the jury board was attempting to purge the roll of voters by claiming that a man had been the defendant in a divorce case and his wife had charged him with cruelty. Well, back during that time, that was a very convenient cause of action for the wife to charge the husband with, because cruelty generally meant not physical cruelty, but mental cruelty. And the judge would grant a divorce readily on that charge. And so that's what the the voter registration people charged the husband with in order to keep the voter roll down. Now, I went to the Board of Registrars in 1958, and that was between my 2nd and 3rd years in law school. And I had taken a year's course of constitutional law the year before I went down. Well, really, it was the 1957-58 school year, and I came home, and then that summer I went down to the Board of Registrars to register to vote. During that time, there was an element that was charged against African Americans, and required them to take a literacy test. Well, literacy means can you read and can you write? Well, you had to fill out an application. And if you could fill out the application, that showed in and of itself that you were literate. You could read and you could write. Well, in addition to filling out the application, the members of the Board of Registrars would ask you to do certain things. And they asked me to interpret the 14th Amendment. My wife tells people that I embellish on this every time I tell the story, that I began to tell them all the cases that I had learned during the past year in constitutional law and learning the 14th Amendment. And so when I began to tell that to the Board of Registrars, they sat there and their mouths were open. They said, "How did you know that?" And I said, well, if you read my application, you would have seen that I'm a rising third-year student at State University of New York Law School, and I know this by heart. And so, and this is very funny, the lady that was administering the literacy test to me threw her hands up and slammed them on the counter, and she said, "Oh, hell, just let the nigger vote."
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. Mr. Davis, take us in the early part of your practice. Bull Connor and his minions were doing their bad deeds and things around the city and
That's
around
right.
the metro area. And we didn't have a mayor per se, but we had his council of government.
That's right. Yeah,
Talk to us about your involvement with that in
All right.
the 60s.
You had a 3-person city commission. One was Jabbo Wagoner, who was the father of our present state senator, Jabbo Wagoner Jr. Art Haynes, who was the father of a former circuit judge, and also Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor. Bull Connor had been elected in the 1930s, and his job was of one thing, and that was to keep the whites and the blacks separated. The foundation of that was money. Birmingham was a heavily industrial city in the early 1960s. It had become that at the time that it was founded. Birmingham was founded to get coal, iron, and limestone out of the ground so that they could make iron at the various steel mills that were put up. And also Birmingham was founded by people who came here from the Midwest and from the East. It was not a typical Southern city. Birmingham did not exist during the Civil War. Well, anyway, Bull Connor was elected for the purpose of keeping the races separated. And if he did that, that would keep the labor unions weak, and the two labor unions, the white labor union and the black labor union, being separate, could not ask to have increases in wages successfully. So that was why Connor was there, and Connor used every conceivable instrument at his disposal to keep blacks separated. The city of Birmingham's leaders, the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce, the Birmingham Bar Association, felt that if Bull Connor remained on the city commission, he was strangling the city because the steel industry was going out of business. The coal mines were going out of business, and they were attempting to bring other types of business to the city of Birmingham. So in order to change the profile of the city of Birmingham, the Birmingham Bar Association constituted a group of lawyers. And some of those that were appointed to that group were Robert Vance, who became a United States federal circuit judge, David Vann, who became the mayor of the city of Birmingham, Erskine Smith, George Peaches Taylor, and others. Well, in order for them to get their work done, and the purpose of the committee was to decide whether or not the city of Birmingham should continue with a 3-man city commission or whether it should change forms. Well, they went out and they did their study, and they came back and they reported to the bar that the city of Birmingham would be better if the 3-person city commission would change to a 9-man city council. And once that happened, they made their report back to the bar, and the bar then went to the city leaders, and they went to Montgomery and got a bill passed that allowed for the vote on the 9-person city changing the form of government. So we went to the court, we went to the polls, and the polls then decided by a margin of 4,000 that the change in the form of government was good. And so we then worked to change it to a 9-person city council and a strong mayor, which is what we have in the city of Birmingham today. And then we had to go back to the polls, and we had to vote again on those persons that ran for the 9 city council offices. And we won again by 4,000 votes. And it just so happened that the number of black voters in the city of Birmingham was 4,000.
Mr. Davis, I've often read that in the 50s and 60s, and even going into the 70s somewhat, African American lawyers who were not involved in litigation, not involved in the civil rights on the front lines, it was very easy to make a decision if they didn't want to be in that line of work. They could do wills and estates and transactional work. And I'm not criticizing anyone who chose that route, but it's clear from me knowing your history, that's not the route you chose. You and your partners chose to get involved, to be active, to make a difference. And these stories that you're sharing with us now, and I know there are many, many other stories, are just, they're fascinating to people like me who didn't grow up in that era but are interested in the topic and the time period. And here is my question. Take us, if you can, through the mindset that you had on a day-to-day basis. It was already hard enough making a living and providing for your young family at the time. Tell us a little bit about your mindset of working in downtown Birmingham. You're an African American man trying to do the right thing in your eyes, but you have the Bull Connors of the world. You have all the bad laws that were in effect at that time. That mindset, maybe now when you look back, maybe not as much of a burden, but I bet on a day-to-day basis it was.
Well, during that period of time, you could only have so many lawyers that handle civil rights cases because of the oppression that had been placed on blacks. Many blacks were afraid to come and assert their civil rights. The assertion of civil rights really did not begin until 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act that had been passed by the United States Congress. And the next year, 1965, the Voting Rights Act. That changed the entire complexion of the city of Birmingham. Well, anyway, my family had gone ahead and they started an insurance company. The name of that company was Protective Industrial Insurance Company. And we sold burial insurance and small face value life insurance. Well, my family made me general counsel for the company. And so I made a portion of my living by being the general counsel for the family business. And various times we would have to go to court, and then I would associate Peter Hall and Orzel Billingsley with me in order to handle the trial work. There were other life insurance companies that were owned by black people in the United States, 7 of which had district offices here in the state of Alabama, and I had worked with the National Insurance Association that composed all of those black-owned companies, and by luck, they came to me and they asked me to represent them. So back during my early days after we had handled the civil rights cases, and Oscar Adams was handling the school integration cases, and Demetrius Newton was being employed to handle open housing and also open accommodations that the city and the county and the state had. And so we would handle civil cases and criminal cases. But bear in mind, because of the oppression, blacks still went to many of the white firms. In 1984, General Friend, Ed Friend, had come to me and he asked me if I would become a member of the surety and permanent law firm, because that December before 1984 came, I had been elected president of the Birmingham Bar Association. I joined the bar in 1971 when it became integrated, and I had been elected 3 years later to the executive committee, and then in 1978 I was elected to the position of secretary treasurer, and I moved up until in 1983 I was elected president of the Birmingham Bar. And General Friend thought that that was a good time for the sorority firm to then hire a black guy who would become a lawyer with this firm. And I came here as a full senior partner, and I have been here ever since.
I was just about to ask you about your friendship with Mr. Friend.
Yes, Mr. Friend was a great man. He had been president of the Chamber of Commerce. He had been president of the Birmingham Bar. He had also been a heavy giver to the well. He was one of the founders of the Tocqueville Society for the United Way, and he helped them raise a great deal of money. And so this firm is a very good giver to United Way, and we have a number of lawyers that are members of the Tocqueville Society, and you can become a member of that by giving $10,000 to the work of United Way.
Mr. Davis, we're now in the year of 2019. You're, as you said earlier, into your 60th year coming up in practice. And I know you're still very active, and you have many young lawyers here who look up to you, who you mentor. I want you to share some of your thoughts about the practice of law today compared to the practice of law when you were first coming up. Obviously, with the advent of social media and society changes, everything is instant gratification, and it's in your face, and I gotta have it now. And it doesn't matter if you're a lawyer or a doctor, whatever you are. It's the younger generation just has to deal with so much more of that than your generation, my generation, ever did. So share with us a little bit of your thoughts about the practice of law today.
Well, when I became a lawyer in 1960, there were 400 and some odd members of the Birmingham Bar. I became the 9th African American lawyer practicing in the city of Birmingham. Today, there are over 1,000 black lawyers that have licenses in the state of Alabama, most of whom are situated here in the city of Birmingham. There were 400 lawyers of all shades in the city of Birmingham. Today, there are 4,000 lawyers in the state of Alabama, and I would imagine that more than half of them are in the city of Birmingham. You can tell that there's a great deal of competition for the business. There's only so much legal business that people in a city of 100 and some thousand people can have. And so they are really fighting over the same, as I say, the same bone. Every day, as soon as you get up, I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I go into the kitchen about 6. I begin watching the news, and ever so often the commercials come on, and at least one or two of them have to do with the lawyers that are attempting to make a living in the personal injury business. They're competing with one another over the same bone that's out there. And so, I'm of the old school, because when I became a lawyer, you could not advertise. You couldn't go to the people and ask them for their business. You had to do the work, and if you did the work for the clients that came to you and you did it well, then the person that you did the work for would go back into the community and they would speak well of you, and some few of them would come to you and ask you to handle their business.
And I think that aspect right there, your reputation, I don't think that ever has changed. That is such an important concept, whether it's 1960, 1980, or 2019.
That's right.
Your reputation is what the word of mouth, I think, is as important as anything else you can do.
I think so. And I think it will continue that way. But the reason why these law firms go on television and they are competing for business is because that is the only way today. Society is you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the other day, a few minutes ago, about asking for things instantly, instant gratification. My son is a lawyer, and I've tried to tell him, don't think that you're going to make a living right away. If you've got a day job, keep your day job. Jay's day job is working for the family business. He's the secretary, treasurer, and general counsel for Davenport and Harris Funeral Home. And I tell him, don't lose your day job and do your practice after you have finished your work with your day job. And because there's thousands of lawyers out here, and they're fighting over the same business.
Mr. Davis, I'd be remiss without mentioning your family. I know this past fall you lost your wife of more than 60 years.
Yes.
And I know she was a blessing for you and still is to you and your family. Tell us about Mrs. Davis and your children.
Well, June Davis and when I met her in 1953, we began courting in 1954. That was the term that was used back during that period of time. And then I fell in love with her right as soon as we started courting. And she was from Jacksonville, Alabama. She's from a very fine family there, the Foxes, and they're probably the oldest black family in Jacksonville. They lived on the main street, Pelham Road, that went right through Jacksonville and split it east and west. June came to Talladega in 1953, and she graduated in June of 1957. I had just finished my last examination. I caught a plane, I came back to Birmingham, and I went down to Talladega College to the baccalaureate service, and as soon as that ended, she and I met outside, and I gave her an engagement ring.
Oh, wow.
And we were married 2 months later.
Wow.
She came to Birmingham with me, and we left and went to Buffalo, and she stayed with me in Buffalo during the winter of 1957. That was probably the coldest winter that Buffalo had ever experienced.
She must have really liked you to spend a winter in Buffalo, New York.
She did. She did. We got in Buffalo, and we lived with my aunt and my cousin, and we had an apartment up on the 3rd level of their house, and we would cook downstairs and we lived upstairs, and she helped us greatly. But in any event, June was pregnant by the time we got to Buffalo, and after Easter passed, the snow went away, and I took her to the airport because she told me, I've been here this winter with you, I love you, but I've got to go back to Alabama. My child is not going to be born in Buffalo. So I took her to the airport, put her on a plane, and she flew back to Birmingham, and my mother and my aunt met her, and when I came back after graduating from law school, then I stayed in Birmingham, and my wife began teaching. Well, when we were in Buffalo, she was a supply teacher for the Buffalo Board of Education, and that was one of the ways that we made a living. I was a clerk for a law firm. They paid me $17.50 a week to be their clerk, and I went to court for them, and I did repossessions for them and all of that sort of thing. And June would work 1 day or 2 days a week. She'd make $17.50 a day. And so we were able to buy groceries and to go to the movie once a month and to have a little spending change. But as soon as she got back to Birmingham, Kay was born in May of 1958, and 1958. And June began teaching for the Birmingham Board of Education in September of 1958. We hired a babysitter who would come to my mother and my aunt's house, and she would clean the house and she would look after Kate. And June would go to school, she would teach. June was a teacher for 5 or 6 years, and that's when the Birmingham Board of Education brought her from Lewis School, where she taught first grade, and she came down to the Birmingham Board of Education's office downtown, and she became a member of the guidance department. And she and Ms. Points were the 2 black members of the guidance department, and they remained in that position until 1971, when white flight began, and the Birmingham public school system changed over from predominantly white to predominantly black. And they then went down to University of Alabama in the latter part of the 1960s and obtained their master's degrees and the ultimate degree from UAB. They had 2 children. Kay is 61. She lives in Brooklyn. She's bought a building in Brooklyn, and she works in New York City. She works for a company called PACE, P-A-S-E. She's had a number of jobs. She went from Birmingham to New York to work with Manufacturers Hanover, and then she left them. She went to First Boston, Bank of Boston. She then went to Dartmouth. That's right up the Connecticut River, north of where she went to undergraduate school at Smith in Northampton, Massachusetts, and she got her master's in business administration from Dartmouth University. And she came back and she worked for Solomon Brothers and Smith Barney on Wall Street. She was a bond trader. And then during the recession of the early 2000s, she lost her position there, and that's where she became the information director for PACE. Jay, who is Julian Mason Davis III, is a practicing lawyer here in the city of Birmingham.
Mr. Davis, I could talk to you all day, but I know you have other things to do today, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom, your experience, and your insight with me today.
Well, thank you very much for thinking of me and asking me to be on your program.
Absolutely. Guys, thank you again for tuning in for another episode of NOMBERG Law Live, as we do every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Pacific. We don't always get the honor and the privilege of having people like Mr. Davis with us, but when we do, we certainly cherish it. Thank you again, and we'll see you again another time. Take care.